Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Ariel Helwani Show!
Hello and welcome to a brand new edition of The Beat on this fourth week of September 2025. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. And yes, you might be asking yourself, what is The Beat? And perhaps you're even saying to yourself, why does that intro sound so familiar? In fact, I haven't said that kind of intro in quite some time because that's how I used to start a show way back when called the MMA Beat. You may recall this was a show that we did for many, many years. And every now and again, I get people reaching out to me saying, when are you going to bring back the MMA Beat? When are you going to bring back the MMA Beat? Well, the times they have changed and our roles have changed and our jobs have changed, but I've always sort of kept it in the back of my mind and also very much aware that we don't just cover MMA around these parts. We cover all things combat sports. And so I'm here to say that it won't be a weekly offering, maybe in every few months, at least for now, and maybe that will change and evolve as well. But I want to bring back this show because I've always loved the sports reporters. That was the genesis of the MMA Beat. And then I took that idea and brought it to ESPN and did the MMA reporters. And so now I just want to go back to the Beat and I want to talk about media. I want to talk about journalism and in particular covering combat sports in the year 2025 because it has never been more interesting and fascinating than now, at least in my opinion. And we here at Uncrowned, I think, do a pretty damn good job of covering it all. And so I have called upon some of my old friends to talk in this particular episode about the current state of MMA and combat media. And so without further ado, let us get into it, shall we? First up, he is, of course, the mayor of the Nutmeg State. He is the man in the hat. You know him. You love him. He's the one and only Chuck Mindenhall. Hello, Chuck. How are you?
I am well, man. How long has it been? It must have been, 5 years since we did one of these?
It has been, if my math is correct, 7. How about that?
Wow.
2019.
Wow, that's a long time, man. I get asked about it a lot, too. So when you said you wanted to try this, I was like, let's get it done, man.
Yes, and we used to do it, in person in that lovely studio. Shout out to the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim, Luke Thomas as well, and perhaps we'll get there. But this works best for all involved because we're international now. And with that in mind, we do say hello to the patron saint of the Emerald Isle, the host of the critically acclaimed podcast, The Crack, Mr. Petesy Carroll. I wasn't sure if that was like a freeze frame there because you were just so stoic. But hello, Petesy. How are you?
I'm just blinded by these bright lights of the beach. You know what I mean? Here I am, finally. One of my favorite shows for so many years. And now on the panel. We made it, baby.
First time?
Yeah. I mean, I thought it was just you lads the whole time, as far as I knew.
Well, there were, a few times some guest appearances, even some celebrity appearances. Shout out to the great Skylar Aston. But yes, it is very good to have you here. And we go in the time machine for our final panelist. He, as many of you know, is the original co-host of the critically acclaimed MMA-rated radio program, which you all loved so very much for about a couple of months back in 2008. He is also currently the co-host of the beloved Co-Main Event podcast. He is the pride of Missoula, Montana. The one and only Ben Fowlkes is here. Hello, Ben. How are you?
I'm great. So, I mean, I enjoyed you guys all going down memory lane talking about that show that I was never invited on. That it seemed fun. It seemed like you guys were always having a good time. I was, the kid upstairs in his bedroom watching out the window as the neighbor kids are all partying in their swimming pool all summer long. But it's nice to have made it here at last.
Well, why talk about the past? You were out there enjoying the blue skies of Missoula, Montana. You were doing your thing. You were not available to us. But now here we are with the advent of Zoom machines and the internet. We could all do this together. And there is a lot to discuss. I'm actually very excited about this. There is no topic that I enjoy discussing, listening, debating more than media, journalism, and of course in our sport, it's an ever-evolving thing. So let's get into it, my friends. And actually, this all kind of kicked off in my brain when I was asked a question a couple of weeks ago. It was an on-the-nose question, and it was about covering Andrew Tate. As you guys know, Andrew Tate, boxing, influencer, social media guy, very controversial, very polarizing. And, this talk of him fighting Darren Till. And someone said to me, like, hey, I get that you have to report on this, but please don't have him on the show. Don't platform Andrew Tate. And I, went on not a rant, but my answer was a little lengthy in saying, like, I don't view covering someone or even having someone on the show as platforming them. If they're in the news, if they're pertinent, if I want to talk to them about fighting because they're about to fight someone or they're in the fight business, that to me is not an endorsement of them. That's not me saying I agree with who they are and what they stand for. It's just they're in the news, and that's what we do. We cover the news. In this day and age, I see that word platforming a lot, Chuck. And so I'll ask you first, am I wrong? Do you understand where I'm coming from? Or do you think that putting someone as controversial in the year 2025, the way media is consumed and the way people cover things these days, putting someone as polarizing and controversial as Andrew Tate is your version of endorsing them? And if you don't believe in what they believe in, or if they have done some, allegedly very bad things, you shouldn't be shining a spotlight on them, even if they are fighting.
Well, I mean, how are you supposed to ignore them? From your platform or what you're doing, right? You're bringing news to the public. You're talking about what is going to happen, or if people are going to fight. If his name, and I mean, obviously he is a name that we've been discussing a long time within this space, is one of the names going to fight, especially against a guy like Darren Till, right? And a Misfits venture that we've been reporting on before. The omission of talking about it would be more glaring than the talking about it. And the talking about it doesn't necessarily mean that you're endorsing it, right? Like this is news, this is information, you're passing it along, and it's for everybody else to basically, it's for everybody else basically to say that they want this product, don't want this product, or whatever it is. But to actually talk about the fight, or if he's going to fight and all that stuff, unless we are giving our opinion, which we do a lot, it's just a fact, right? Like if it's a fact, you're going to talk about it. We have a lot of these figures in this sport. I don't know if we have any. I don't know if we have as many that are as gloatingly like in a space like Andrew Tate, where it's just kind of a guy who has had so many happy bad headlines, like where he's for so long persisted as this misogynist and being in trouble for the sex trafficking and all the things that he's done. I don't know if we've had guys that are like this exactly. It is very different in that sense, but he does have the kickboxing. I think he has an MMA fight. If he's going to be in a big venture like Misfits, we are going to have to talk about it. That's just the truth of it.
How do you feel about this, Ben? Because and you don't have to specifically talk about Andrew Tate, because as Chuck just mentioned, there's a lot of questionable characters in this sport. And so where do you draw the line between just covering and, as people like to say these days, platforming?
Yeah, well, I think that the important difference is sort of in the context of what we're doing and how we're presenting it. Because it's one thing to say, hey, this guy has signed a fight, he's going to fight this guy on this date. That's true. That is, if that's a fact, if that's news, then there's no really case for avoiding even mentioning the person's name, like he's Voldemort or something. However, if we're going to have him on the show, or have him on like one of the shows where we're interviewing him, I do think then it's important to get the full context and not have him just come on as if, hey, you're just a fighter, man, who's here to fight Darren Till, and that's why we're talking to you. Because the full context is the reason they would want somebody like Andrew Tate to fight Darren Till is not because of his accolades as a fighter. It's because he's controversial. It's because he brings views. It's because people would be like, you're doing what? Which is kind of a big part of Misfits' whole brand, which I'm not necessarily knocking them for that in general, because you got to do something to stand out in the crowded combat sports landscape. But that's why. It's not because they think Andrew Tate is such a good fighter that the world had been begging to see him and Darren Till fight. It's because of the controversy, and they hope that it'll bring views. So if you're going to have him on, if we're going to actually talk to him and engage with him, I think the difference between platforming and actually doing journalism and talking to the guy is if we're addressing that context. Because you know how a lot of these people will like to do, especially if they can say, hey, I have pending legal action I don't want to discuss. People will do this stuff before interviews. So they'll say, yes, I'll do the interview, but you got to pretend that none of this other stuff that I don't want to talk about or is inconvenient for me to talk about, just pretend it doesn't exist. That I think you can't do. If you're going to have the guy on, if we're going to engage with him directly, then I think we have to look at the full context and say, hey, how do you feel about it that they are basically trying to use your controversy? Also, what the hell, man? It kind of seems like you can't go more than a couple months without there being some kind of like sexual assault or something allegation against you. What's up with that? Like, if we're going to have that conversation, I think you got to have the full conversation. Otherwise, I think then you do veer into where you're just giving this guy an opportunity to use combat sports to try to whitewash his image.
You know, Ben brings up a great point, Petesy, because I've been in this situation a lot. In fact, it just happened very recently. I'm sure you have been as well, where someone says, can you send me the questions in advance? Can you send me the topics in advance? I hate this. I've talked many times about the time that I went in 2015 to interview John Jones in Albuquerque after his hit and run. This was about 8 months after the hit and run. His first interview, we're there, myself, Casey Leiden, Esther Lynn, we're in Albuquerque. It's the morning of the interview. We're having breakfast, and his PR person calls me up and says, "We need the questions." And I'm like, "What are you talking about? I don't have the questions. I don't walk around with a sheet of questions, especially not on camera. It's ludicrous." And we got into a whole thing. What do you do when you're presented with this situation? We need the topics. We need the questions. We know there's controversy, and if you don't give it to us, maybe there's no interview.
I think you have to walk away at that point if we're trying to do what we're trying to do. You can't do it, and especially like if we are framing this segment of the conversation around Tate, like I agree with Ben. I think you need to provide that context, and I feel like there is a different reaction to him in the US than there is in the UK and Ireland. Honestly, like I mean, children are being kind of alerted to what Tate is over here in schools. We know adolescents after winning a lot of Emmys, I believe it is. It's a story about a child kind of being led astray by this toxic masculinity kind of thing. We see a lot of it over here. I don't think you can provide questions, especially to someone like this who was controversial. And as you've mentioned, Ariel, on the show, if he is going to fight in Misfits, and I think Misfits is the only place that could viably get away with putting on an Andrew Tate show. Honestly, like I said this to Eddie Hearn just a couple of weeks ago in Belfast, I was like, you would be crucified for trying to put Andrew Tate into a real boxing match, because he is a real sport element. As he said to me, well, Misfits isn't boxing. I think that's where he tried to exist. And to Ben's point about trying to provide him, like frame him as this ultra strong guy, I think, as you've said before, he would probably go in there and fight a can and look very good doing it. Like, this guy has a kickboxing record, a very good one at that. We've seen videos of him online beating up random guys in Romania, like 10 at a time, but like just guys off the street. So I think that would be the thing we would have to be wary of. Like, what is he trying to gain from this situation? Like, what is he trying to gain from going in and fighting on Misfits who, you know, and again, probably fighting someone that doesn't have a very noted MMA record, someone like we kind of saw Dylan Dennis fight recently.
Chuck, I said that I don't even believe in the word platforming, because to me, that suggests that we only talk or cover people that we want to prop up. And I feel like this is like a new term that has come up over the last couple of years. I just believe if you're going to cover someone, yes, cover them thoroughly, cover them honestly, cover them fairly. But I always go back to this Larry King interview with Yasser Arafat on CNN, where I thought, this guy probably doesn't like this guy probably doesn't believe in what this guy believes in. They don't come from the same places, but they're able to have a good, respectful conversation. How do you feel about this notion of platforming? Is that because you look at the news, and especially in political media, and we're not necessarily talking about that, but it's like you're only going to talk favorably about what you believe in and negatively about what you don't believe in. And I don't think that's the way it goes. And for some reason, sports media doesn't conduct itself the same way, but still you'll see people be like, oh, you're going to talk to this guy, or you're going to talk about this and not admonish it or not put it down. Well, I don't feel like we should pick and choose like that.
I feel like we all come from journalism backgrounds, right? We come from the way journalism has always been done, which is basically that you're trying to get to the truth of the matter with whatever you're talking about. And that's your job, right? Is to present something that is the truth. When you ask people to avoid certain truths, it starts to make no sense. In fact, I was thinking about this with Greg Hardy. You remember when he kind of debuted in the UFC? So you get Greg Hardy, and it was like there was a big like, what is the outcry? The outcry is like, wait a minute, this guy just got booted out of pro football for a domestic assault, like some really heinous stuff, right? But he ends up in the UFC, and we were never given really an explanation as to why the UFC. I mean, we know that they were a safe haven for certain misadventures from other fighters, like who could get second chances in this place. But this seemed like a step in a crazy direction, especially because he was on a fight card with Rachel. What was her name?
Ostovich. Yep.
Yes, Ostovich, which was nuts. It was kind of like, what is going on? So I remember going to that media day, you know, when they would have all the fighters kind of gathered together and going up, and you're about to ask him like questions of what people would want to know, which is anything to do with his past, to redemption, all these things. And there was kind of this whispering from his handlers, like, hey, let's keep it to the fight. Keep it to the fight. Let's just talk about the fight here. You know what I mean? And I was like, that's impossible, man. I was arguing with people. I'm like, that's impossible. You can't. We got to ask him about this. The context of why he's even in the UFC matters. He's only in the UFC because he has a name. I mean, they were putting him on like like one of the major cards, one of the major broadcast cards for these reasons. And so that is part of the story. And so much of what we do is tell a fighter's story. To start leaving facts out of that story is anti-journalism, isn't it, at some point? And I feel like that goes against the grain of everything we were ever taught and everything really that has stood journalistically before it.
That's a phenomenal point. Ben, have you ever been in a situation like that where someone has tried to stop you from asking or stop you from covering the full story the way it should be told?
Oh yeah, many times, and especially I think with fight sports already, we sort of exist as this like island of misfit toys in a lot of ways. Where a lot of the people who go on to have great careers in fight sports, this wasn't their first idea. This wasn't Plan A for a lot of those people. They tried other sports, they tried other avenues, and they ended up in this world, and they found that they were really good at it. And so, a lot of times, promoters, whoever, really want to use those contexts to sell the fight. They really want you to talk about all these other things. And then when it's inconvenient for them, they don't. And I've been in several situations where people have tried to tell me like, hey, we got to just talk about this. No questions about that. And, you know, if it's something that I feel is relevant to the story, then I've always took the approach like, if you're trying to tell me what kind of story I have to write, then I'm not going to write it. I can do something else. No one story is ever the kind where I'm just like, well, my career is going to be over if I don't get this story. You know, it's crazy to me sometimes when people, especially in fight sports, I think we saw it a little bit at that Canelo Crawford press conference where Dana White, as soon as he started hearing some questions he didn't like that were pushing back against the TKO's approach to the Ali Act, went, hey, we're here to talk about the fight. Talk to the two fighters. Well, if that's the case, why are you there? You're not fighting. So exactly why are you standing there? And I think that's the thing where people want to hide behind that. Like, hey, we just want to talk about the sport. We just want to talk about the actual fighting. Well, first of all, the fight hasn't happened. You're only going to have so much to say beforehand about the fight. Great training camp. I think I'm going to win. No, I think I'm going to win. You know, there's not that much really you can do with that. Plus, when it's nice stuff that people have to say or interesting and relatively harmless stuff that people are talking about as the context around a fight, those narratives, that's part of what we're here for. That's part of what the fight game is. It's just when they decide, hey, we don't like it, this isn't useful for us, this is uncomfortable for us, then they want to steer you away from it. You can't let those people decide what the story is. They can't be the ones to tell you, here's the kind of story you have to do. And if you let them guide what kind of questions you ask, then you are letting them do that.
Okay, so let's talk about that press conference because again, it was very much in focus, and it got into a whole MMA media versus boxing media thing, and Dana White and his view of media and whatnot. Just we'll start here. We'll start here, Petesy. Was it fair to ask that question? Because Dana's stance was it wasn't fair. Meaning like not the time nor the place. You got Canelo, you got Crawford there. Like, don't talk to me about the Ali Act. Talk to me about these guys. Of course, we've seen many an instance where Dana White has asked a whole bunch of stuff when other fighters are up there and he doesn't have an issue, but this obviously a pretty controversial one. And you know, he doesn't want to talk about it on a stream in front of 100,000 or so people. I have seen people out there say, you know what, it wasn't the time nor the place. What do you think?
I think Eddie Hearn made a great point last week when he's on your show. You asked him about this and he said, well, and I saw this when I was in Belfast a couple of weeks ago. He will hang around for 5 hours doing these interviews with people. I've seen that at a number of events. I can remember us marveling at this at the first Taylor Serrano fight. I know you were working that, but me and Chuck were watching Eddie Hearn go diligently to each camera and talk to all these people. Dana White doesn't do that anymore. He is very selective where he shows up. He's appearing on Nelk Boys podcast. He's appearing on these shows where he knows it's going to be a favorable situation for him. So while there is a point maybe that is for a private discussion, that question that was asked regarding the Ali Revival Act, there is no opportunity to do that with Dana White. So here's a guy seeing this situation and he's saying, well, this is my only chance to ask this question. Therefore, I'm going to go for it. One thing I did say to the lads a couple of weeks ago when this happened was, isn't it crazy that is now the thing that sticks out at a press conference? Because it's so uncommon for a question like that to be asked at a UFC press conference. And that looked, maybe it was just because Dana White was up there and he got up straight away and he said, let's go with the questions. There was no foreplay whatsoever. Yeah, go
dude,
ahead.
If you have a situation, now let's say that Eddie Hearn shows up at a UFC podium between two UFC fighters. What is everybody going to say at this point, right? Like if Eddie is suddenly like, hey, I want to get an MMA, we might want to change some of the structure for me to get into this so I can take it. Wouldn't you be like, especially if you're an MMA beat reporter, wouldn't your first question be like, why the fuck are you here, man? Like, you know what I mean? You'd be wondering like, why are you here? That's the question.
At that press conference where Max Kellerman got up and was giving the, let's say, over-the-top introductions for people like Turki Al-Sheikh and for Dana White, he went on and on at length about Dana White's getting into boxing, and he's bringing the UFC stuff, that all the amazing things he did with the UFC, he's going to bring that to boxing. Right there.
NBA, NFL.
Where he was just like, you wanted an NBA and NFL and boxing? Here it comes. And when you do that, when you open like that, you've swung the door open at that point. Like, you might think you want to later keep the conversation at the press conference about the two fighters, but you didn't a few minutes ago when you introduced the guy and you were making it a big story. Hey, this guy is coming over from this world. He's going to take the stuff he did in that world. He's going to bring it over to our world. Okay, so then let's talk about that, because clearly it was enough of a point of interest for them to bring up at the press conference. Don't get mad when somebody asks you a question to follow up on the thing that you already brought up. It's clearly a thing that's on people's minds. So be willing to talk about it. And I also thought, I agree with Petesy that it was disingenuous of him to be like, hey, no, we'll do it later. We'll do it like a private interview. Will you though?
Not doing that.
Will you though? Because everything we've led to believe, like it's the same thing what we saw where Dana White was getting into that Vegas PBS reporter, and you went, oh, he looks a little shaken here, a little frazzled, because he's so used to doing podcast interviews with people who don't really know the world that he comes from, don't know if what he's saying is true or not, and aren't in the business of pushing back on anything, are just kind of like, hey, we're all here to have a good time and make money, stay friends. And then when he encounters somebody who's a real journalist and has done her homework and is willing to push on it, he looks uncomfortable because he doesn't encounter that much anymore.
I thought it was so telling that he used the words, you're being an asshole or you're showboating, because that's the way in which he views, I think, pretty fair questions. Now, the tone, is it controversial? Who knows? Those were very fair and well-researched questions. I also thought the delivery was interesting in that the reporter Sean Zattel kind of started off with a bit of a compliment. You soften him, and then you try to hit him with the questions. In the end, he didn't get answers. But what it did remind me of was the fact that I think, and maybe I'm wrong, guys, 10 years ago, those types of questions at UFC press conferences weren't out of the norm. I think all of us attended press conferences and asked questions, and there's tape of us asking questions to fighters, to the president of the UFC, Dana White, and it's been so long. And when I say this, I'm not trying to put down the traveling media. They all get the landscape. They all have to sit there. We're not sitting there more often than not. So I understand that it's a little bit different. But Chuck, am I wrong? Like, this was like 10 years ago, between the scrums and the pressers and all the access that Dana gave us, sort of like Eddie Hearn in the year 2025, he was answering these questions. And was he combative at times? Yes, but he was fielding them and he was answering them in his own specific way, in his own unique way. Now he just doesn't field them anymore. And that's what made the PBS interview with Amber Dixon and this 2-minute exchange so profound, because it just seemed so out of the ordinary.
He just hasn't had to. Petesy mentioned this earlier. He's used to now going on friendly podcasts or whatever it's going to be, where guys are just not going to ask him these kinds of questions. But we always were curious, especially as the sport grew and the UFC kind of grew towards what it became, what the motivations were behind everything. I mean, literally everything. We were always wondering, why did we do this? Why did we do this? And anything that was glaring like that, and everybody knew that there was some glaring thing happening, you would get reprimanded if you didn't ask that question, wouldn't you? I mean, I felt like back in the day, especially you, Ariel, because I know that a lot of times you would have the mic pretty early in those things, and if you weren't asking a very specific question, you would hear from it. I would go to your comments and see that people are like, "Why didn't you ask him about this?" You know, it was more conspicuous if you didn't ask the question. You know what I mean? So it's just been a 180 in that sense. And I think that Dana himself has put him in positions where he doesn't need to answer tough questions. But we were talking about this a little bit on the crack a couple of weeks back, where we said that it was a weird look for him to be so caught off guard. And that kind of tells you, though, what he's been used to over the last year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, whatever it's been.
PT, do you think we ever get back to those days? Do you think it will ever be like 10 years ago with the access and the questions and it wasn't made out to be such a big deal? Or is this just the state of MMA media? Because the UFC has been able to craft what they think MMA media should be and who is kind of getting access, right? It's either a former fighter who, might ask a question or two, but nothing really pressing, or, a sort of influencer type. And again, I'm not putting any of them down. They all have their lane. They all have their talents. It's all well and good. But let's be honest, you go to the other side of the fence and you go to the boxing side of the fence, and, the promoters and the particulars involved are being hit with a lot of tougher questions because it's sort of like the wild, wild west. Are we ever going to get back to that? Or do you think that train has left the station and because the UFC is so dominant, they can dictate it?
I think the media landscape changed profoundly during COVID, when it was Fight Island, and basically the media and the UFC are living together at that point. Like, you remember all of the hoops he had to jump through to get to Abu Dhabi in the first place. There was chartered flights, all this kind of stuff. The very model of the press conference, what it used to be, or the media day changed. I used to love the old media days, when you get all of the fighters and they're all standing at their different stations, and we just had a free for all of running up to them, asking whatever we want. Now it's all just this group setting. It's like being in school when you were a kid. You sit in a room for 7 hours, and 24 fighters get up one after another as you sit there and you pepper them with questions. I think they're quite happy with that. As we've mentioned so many times, the UFC is not the scrappy upcomer that it once was, that was relying heavily on media and chasing media interest. They have all that now, billions upon billions it's worth, and we've seen that with the TV deal, etc. I think we're a long way away from it. I think something would probably have to go wrong for the UFC for them to become such an open book and open up all their access again. But I've been to UFC events in the last year or so, and it just doesn't feel like an environment for journalism anymore. It doesn't feel like that's encouraged in those situations. And I think that's why it was so crazy when that question was asked, and it just seemed so bizarre. As you mentioned, like, this was commonplace when you guys were going to these events week upon week, and now it's just shocking actually to see a question like that being asked. And unfortunately, that's the way they've built the system, and I think it will remain until they have to covet interest from the media again. And I don't know when that will be.
Don't you think some of that you're bringing up, PC? I mean, I agree with you. The UFC are pretty happy with the way it works now, but don't you think at least some of that is that the economic realities of trying to be a media member are different now? Like, if you're a young person starting out, maybe you're just out of college, you're trying to find a way to some sort of media career, and you're passionate about MMA, fight sports, whatever, you're trying to find, how do I make a living at this? How do I find a career in this? You see a lot of the people choosing something that's a little bit more influencer-ish than it is reporter-ish. And I totally understand why they would choose that, or why they would think that that is the best available option, because they're looking around and it's not like there's a ton of media outlets anymore that are hiring just people to do regular straight up reportage on the ground at the press conference kind of stuff. I mean, either you're there grinding it out, following the UFC wherever it goes and just like churning out content, or you're trying to become part of the story yourself in one way or another, where you're the influencer and the person, you're just kind of going to cozy up to whoever has an open wallet and is willing to give you some of the money. And a lot of times that's been the UFC, or it's been one of the UFC's sort of broadcast partners or something. And so you get into that situation where I think these people are looking at it just like a practical reality standpoint, and they're being like, that's not what this economic marketplace rewards anymore, is going out there and asking these hard-hitting questions. Nobody's paying me to do that. What they're paying me to do is become a personality that people want to watch, or something along those lines. And I think that, that's not necessarily on the UFC. That's on like a changing media landscape in general.
And this worries me, guys, because I think, okay, I put myself in my shoes from 15 or so years ago, and I see okay, there's a lane you can interview fighters. I could do it a little bit differently. Okay, this is going to be the way that I'm going to break through and get noticed. How do you do that in 2025? Like there's very little access. Those media days don't exist. Some of my favorite moments, some of my favorite interactions came in those ultimate media days that they used to call, on the Wednesday before, because you got 5, 6, 7 minutes, you got an hour, and there's like 12 guys there, and you just had to pick and choose your spots, but you got those interactions, and you got maybe some good stuff. And if you are writing a story, you can spend a lot of time with people. A writer has different different objectives than a video reporter, like I was for the most part. But now you look at it and you're like, oh, how am I going to break through? And that worries me that the next generation, like I try to look, especially now with Uncrowned, you try to see, okay, who's coming up, who's doing what, who's got something that maybe down the line could differentiate themselves. And Chuck, I don't see it in MMA. Am I wrong? Like you probably are looking at some of the writers. Who's coming up that's trying to be the next Chuck Mindenhall or Ben Fowlkes or Shaheen Al-Shadi? I don't see these people, and I worry that they're just trying to be what the UFC has almost like crafted in our brains, or at least have tried to send out the bat signal that this is all you can be if you want to be invited here. And that's a problem, because we know that's not journalism, that's not media, and that's not sustainable. There's no longevity in that. And so I worry, what is this all going to look like in 10, 15 years when we're all old and gray and maybe not doing this anymore?
Man, I used to worry, like, you think about this a lot. You would think, who will be the guy that's trying to replace me at some point? Because at one point you're breaking into a sport, and at the time, let's face it, there weren't a lot of chroniclers in MMA. Going back to the aughts when I started writing about it, and Ben was starting to write about it, and others. But you always thought that the way it worked is eventually you look over your shoulder, and there's going to be somebody coming up who's doing it better than you, or whatever it is. Our biggest thing has been that the model is trying to change with the model. Like, the model has changed to the point where you're not looking over your shoulder this way. You want to stay relevant in the sense that everybody's expecting a different kind of footage now, or a different kind of content. And I feel like that's where it gets very scrambled as to what's happening now. I wish it was as simple as just a very good writer is coming up behind me, and they're, you know what I mean, and they're ready to take my spot. That would be the normal way of looking at things and the normal way of dealing with things. But in our landscape today, there's just too many of the influencers, and some of them who kind of cross over in a bigger way to the UFC, and kind of make it part of their beat. Like, they just are at everything, the Theo Vons of the world, like, who's a comedian, but like the guys who kind of come in and they draw a ton of eyes. And, they're what they're doing is so different. But people are paying attention to it. And so it's like, I feel like that is worrisome on those levels, because I'm like, where is that headed? For the longest time when I got into it, you read chroniclers, and I'm sure Ben did this, and Petesy, like, you read the chroniclers of boxing, and you knew who stood there. You knew who did it. You knew who, and that's who you were chasing. I don't know what the chase is now. It's like the chase is something different. It's not exactly to be the best writer in the sport, So it's like, once that changes, it becomes very concerning for me, especially when you see the UFC reclining, getting very comfortable with that idea.
Should we have like pushed back at all? And I'm aware that there was a union for journalists. I don't know how active it is now, but I can remember when this occurred to me that media in MMA share the same room as influencers, as all these kind of people. I can remember speaking to a soccer reporter about it, and I was just like, for instance, how would you feel if you're in your media setup at a World Cup, and they put like iShow Speed beside you, and he's streaming throughout the event, and you're trying to hit these deadlines, and this guy, and he's like, that would never happen. Like, what do you? That'd be ridiculous. Like, there's there's a separate thing altogether. Like we were in different areas doing different things. Like they wouldn't be around us. And I wonder, had the union kind of done what it set out to do, and have been able to challenge the UFC on decisions like that, like would there been more pushback? Like, should there have been more pushback? Do you think, Ariel?
Well, that's a great question. And when we were talking earlier about the newer generation, it made me think of the MMA which is no longer really a thing. It just kind of fizzled out and died. And it's one of my big regrets, and it's a sore spot for me. And I know, Ben, you were actively a part of it as well. And I think we all were very sincere in our interest and in our hope of making this into a thing. Among my many regrets is that I think that our timing was off. In retrospect, we had always kind of talked about it, but the fact that it spawned on the heels of the incident at UFC 199, where I was banned and Esther and Casey were escorted out, it felt like that was the catalyst, when in reality, we wanted to do this 5, 6, 7 years prior. We just didn't have our stuff together, and we were young and all just trying to figure it out. And so I think in retrospect, the train had already left the stations. The standards and the procedures were already in place. Now, you look back and it's like the sport was only, 23 years old. And so, baseball and football and boxing and all these old guard sports, they didn't have journalist associations or unions or whatever you want to call them on day one. So we weren't that late, but it felt like the UFC just had such a stranglehold on the way in which they want to do things that they would just look at us and laugh. And so I just wish we would have done it 5, 6, 7 years prior and would have been able to establish it as this thing where we're not trying. I always used to use the word fellowship because I wanted it to be a place where younger journalists can interact with the older guard, if you will, learn and ask questions and have a sense for what it's like being in a media room and what it's like dealing with some of these issues. And, I have an issue here with this guy who's mad at me because he said it was on the record, off the record, whatever. That's why I wanted to do it. I think people thought that it was our way of fighting back to the UFC, and that was never the intention. It just kind of crystallized, I think, in a lot of our minds after what happened at UFC 199, like, oh man, we should really try to do something like this. At that point, I don't think the UFC respected it.
I think that, as I recall it, we had gotten an effort kind of started a little bit years before that, and then it just sort of petered out just because everybody gets pulled in their own directions, and we didn't sustain any momentum there. And then it was after that thing happened at UFC 199, I remember that I sent an email back to the same group that had discussed this, years earlier, and I was just like, so are we going to do it now, or are we going to wait until next time?
Right.
Because there'll be a next time, if you, and that was when we finally started to get going. Now, I will say, if I had known what a pain in the ass it was going to be, I might not have sent that email, because it was a lot tougher than I thought. I think we kind of benefited at the time a little bit from naivete, because we didn't realize how much was going to have to go into it, how many hours would be spent on these emails and recrafting these documents and trying to figure out how to do it. And I know, at least like for me personally, because it was like I ended up being the president there for a while, and I was just like, man, there were a lot of things going on in the personal life at that time, and I was like, I don't have any extra bandwidth for the MMA which was a thing that we were all kind of feeling our way. We didn't have anybody to kind of show us how this stuff is even supposed to work, what you're supposed to do. We just saw like, hey, the baseball writers have one, football writers have one. Maybe we could have one, but then once we got one, we didn't exactly know what it's supposed to do, how we're supposed to use it. And I think you're right, Ariel. One of the best things that it could be for is for support, because a lot of times, especially in this sport, we're not that dissimilar from the fighters. A lot of people found their way into this and we're just sort of like, I'm figuring it out as I go. And there's not a whole lot of precedent set for how you're supposed to be an MMA journalist. And so they're kind of looking around at each other and trying to figure out, what should we do? How should we do this? What should we definitely avoid doing? And there wasn't really any sort of like framework to help you figure that stuff out. And so that was one of the things that I thought that it had the potential to offer, but it also just got like, we started that thing pretty shortly before COVID. which changed a lot of the way the sport was operating, as PC pointed out. Also changed who had jobs and who didn't. COVID saw a big wave of media layoffs and stuff, as I'm sure Chuck and I both remember from our time at
I remember that.
So like there was a lot going on in all senses, but yeah, I do think that there is still a place for something like that. It's just it's hard to know how to get it going and sustain it.
Is it too late?
I don't ever want to say it's too late. I think there's always an opportunity to do something new, or to re-inject some life into stuff. I think sometimes when we ask ourselves questions like, could we go back to this era? That's what I think we can't do. I think nothing ever goes back,
Right,
and the only way is to find a way forward. And I think you're right that there was a sense at the time like, hey, we are standing up for ourselves against the UFC. And really the focus and the narrative maybe should have been on like, we're helping each other figure this out.
It was tough to do it earlier though, guys. I mean, I felt like, I remember what you're talking about, Ben, from like the previous, years, hearing about it, trying to come together from years earlier. And the barrier for entry in MMA, like coverage of MMA, was very low. And if you guys remember, I mean, there were a lot of people who were sort of masquerading around as journalists even back then that didn't really have journalistic backgrounds. They found their way into the sport because there was no real barrier of entry. But you already had a precedent being, placed with the guys like Josh Gross early on. What was that, going back to like tough, right? Like the first versions of that, like in, Loretta Hunt, and some of the ones that were like, blacklisted early in this sport. It was always part of what we understood, but it was a precedent that was also there too, that, hey, you could lose your credentials. This could happen to you, but nobody was really, like, you didn't have enough of a camaraderie or even an idea if the sport would survive, early on as it was going, to put something together. And I think when you mentioned the timing, I remember like thinking of this at the time, because we were acting, and I thought it was great that it galvanized into an action. And I remember when people were getting together in 2017, 2018 at these events. But you get like Josh Gross, and I love Josh Gross. Worked with him many years, same as you've been. Like he became like the president of this, right? And I think that some of these optics and everything looked a little like vendetta, or like a little bit like hey, this is a response. We're like, anti whatever, UFC, and it had a hard time. I just remember a lot of the pushback from from the public, or like certain public that didn't trust or understand what this thing was all about. But the timing was, I wish we could have done it earlier. If we had done this earlier, who knows what this would look like. But it just, when you look back at the pieces, it was just very, very difficult over those years, those initial years before the boom period and all that stuff, to really bring in enough media outlets and the personnel and the people covering it, and to find like solid ground there.
Yeah, another regret that I have is that, we were trying to figure out like who's full-time, who's part-time.
Right.
And I think what we quickly figured out was those who were full-time had different intentions than those who were maybe not full-time, part-time, and I felt a clear divide there from the ones that like sincerely wanted to try to figure this out, to the ones who like it was no skin off their back if it didn't work out, because they have a whole other life. And a whole other, work. So,
well, there was also though a clear divide, as I recall it, between the people who felt like, well, yeah, sure, a journalist association would help some of you little guys, but I'm gonna be all right. I feel pretty comfortable in my spot, and this collective action, if anything, like I might be, sticking my head up too high and get it lopped off. Like I'm doing fine as it is, and so I don't want to get in unless I see that it already works. Like there was some of that too.
You're 100% right. There were several notable names that wanted nothing to do with it, and I'm not quite sure how that all turned out. I do hope that in the future something like this can exist, but you look at it on the boxing side of things. Like, imagine Dana says, hey, guy who asked me that question, you're out, your credentials are gone. Does the Boxing Writers Association of America, very established, they've been around for a very long time, God bless them, if they raise their hand and say, hey, TKO, no, you can't do that, what is TKO going to do? Are they going to be, you know what, we're sorry, we didn't realize that this is how you guys did? No, they're going to be like, go F yourself. And so the structure of this Wild West that we call combat sports is completely different than the NBA, NFL, and NHL. I want to ask you about something, Pete.
I mean, look at Lance Pugmire, though. Same thing, right? Like this happened.
Exactly. It's a tremendous point. He's working for boxing scene. He's well respected. He's won awards. The UFC likes him. He's been to every UFC event that he's applied for credential for, but there was an issue with boxing scene, and he was a casualty. PT, I want to ask you about the tricky dance that is covering people that you either grow to have some kind of relationship with or not. Meaning, look, we're all human beings. And I say this all the time when I'm talking about this stuff. We all have feelings. We all have emotions. We all like some certain people and others we don't really like or vibe with or text with or whatever. And I'll never forget meeting Daniel Cormier for the first time in 2009 at a Strikeforce Chicago open workout. And he says, hey, let's go get some lunch. And I'm like, no, sorry, sir. I don't eat with fighters. I don't go out with fighters. I don't fraternize with fighters. And he's like, I'm going to make you my friend one day, Helwani. I'm going to make you my friend. And, fast forward to his retirement fight against Stipe. And I was like curled up. I'm not going to lie. I was doing a show with him. We were open. We were out as good friends. And I'm like a ball. I never felt that way because this to me was my friend fighting his retirement fight. And I wanted the best for him. I didn't want Stipe to lose necessarily, but I didn't want him to get embarrassed, knocked out, whatever. And so how do you deal with that? You have great relationships with fighters you've been around. And then you have other relationships that aren't good. And my question is, how do you deal with covering them fairly? If there's a fighter that you have a great relationship that you text with, their family, their wife, their kids, whatever, but you have to call them out. You have to cover something that isn't favorable. What do you do in that situation? And the same sentiment goes for, you have a guy that you don't have a great relationship, but you got to give him props, or vice versa. You don't have a good relationship and you don't have to give him props and you have to criticize them and it makes it worse. How do you deal with these real life emotions that I think some people don't recognize when they consider media covering human beings?
I mean, it is a very difficult situation to be in, and I have been in it, obviously, covering Conor McGregor. I was supposed to write his autobiography. The book is not happening for all the people who ask. It was never going to happen, really.
It should still happen. I think you can still pull it off, Petesy. I believe.
I don't know.
Be a much more interesting book now.
Yeah,
it'll be a novel, but it'll be interesting.
So basically, Conor, he picked me to write the book. He fired a guy that this book company, Gil McMillan in Ireland, had given him, and he hired me. He rang me one Christmas Eve, and he said, this is the direct quote. He rang me. He said, "You are aware that I am writing a book. You will now write said book." That's what he said on the phone. That was a real phone call, and I was working in some press release company while doing MMA on the side. So I was writing for Vice, I was writing for the Daily Mail, I was writing for the Irish Mirror. There's another one I'm missing. I was writing for about 4 or 5 freelance pieces while I was doing this other thing. He rang me while I was in the office. So I basically left that job that day and I was like, right, well, this is an opportunity to try and pursue this full time. Conor obviously was in a very his career was meteoric. His earning potential was changing every single month. And I quickly realized that's this deal that he signed in the summer of 2014 probably wasn't worth all that much to him by the summer of 2015 when I was sent to Vegas to write this book with him. He's about to fight Mendes. His knee is in bits. And once again, from a point of view of watching this guy and seeing what he did against Mendes, knowing he could barely walk in the lead up, unbelievable. Absolutely fantastic. I couldn't believe how well he fought in that fight. But that was a real deterioration of the relationship because I'm working for a book company who are trying to release a book, and they are saying, "Where is this book?" Conor isn't all too keen on writing the book, so I felt like friction began then. I was then asked to write for the Mac Life. And I said, I can't, man. I'm trying to be. I wasn't asked directly by Conor in this situation. It was a guy who was running the company. And I said, I can't. I'm trying to be a journalist, and that would be a massive conflict of interest for me. And then shortly thereafter that, when the Mac Life got up and running, and I know the lads there, this is no dig at them whatsoever. I went to interview these guys, the same guys I'd been interviewing since 2009, 2010, people around Conor in his camp or whatever, and they told me that they could only speak to the Mac Life. And so that's like a a knife in the heart of a writer who's like been following this particular group up until this moment. So that was about 2016, 2017, probably around Alvarez, and then into the Mayweather fight. I was kind of like, I'm not going to be able to talk to those people. Now, I did, to their credit, Owen Roddy would speak to me, Artem Lobov, but I wouldn't have any direct contact, and a lot of the guys would just stay away from me completely. I always just tried to call it down the middle, like especially the sport in general was completely besotted with McGregor at the time, which was a weird feeling, like I knew so much, I knew the guy so well, but I was kind of had the door closed on me. But what it also forced was you to really kind of gather information. And it kind of turned me into a better journalist, because before I could rely on the first person contact I'm having with these fighters. If John Kavanagh's telling me the fight's going well, oh, I can write the headline. John Kavanagh saying the fight's going well. Connor said this is the best camp of my life. This is the best camp of my life. This caused me to be a lot more covert, where I have to ask questions, try and dig around, see what was going on. And I always remember a clear distinction, a clear kind of line in the sand for me, and McGregor's fans and his people at the time, was a pre-fight show we did before he fought Habib, and you had me on your show, Ariel, and I picked Habib to win the fight. And I was like, I haven't been hearing good things, and you were like, well, what are you seeing? I was like, well, I see him drinking at the press conference too. I know for sure Habib's not doing that. And I picked Connor to lose the fight, Habib to win. And the knives were out then, let me tell you. And then
why are you booing him? He's right though, Pete. He turned it out to be 100% right.
I know, but like they don't really care about that at the time. But
they wanted you to go down with the ship, is that it?
This is it. And they also that fight was remembered for the fracas that happened afterwards. And Connor was already becoming persona non grata in Ireland at this stage, due to like the homophobic slurs he had after the Feely fought Artem Lobov. There was, he had a few brushes with the law up at that point that were well reported. He was acting more outlandish, as we always say. Like there's a line after that Mayweather fight where the wheels started to come off. Although that situation that happened after the Habib fight was absolutely none of Connor's, like it wasn't Connor's situation. People got in, they were attacking him in the cage. Habib jumps over, he tries to fight Dylan Dennis. The reaction in Ireland was to say, this is bullshit. They're like, this sport what is this? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, why are we portraying this man as a role model? MMA is not a sport, which forced me to try and go into the community and say, like, come on, defend your sport. Like, don't just leave me here on these debate shows. Like, the people are doing it. Come out and say something. And they didn't. And I can remember the exchange at the time with power brokers within that kind of camp and within the sport. I was furious with them. I was like, this is ridiculous. Like, you're gonna get a 10-8 round scored on you by the Irish media who know nothing about the sport. There's a perfect opportunity for you to come out and explain the amateur program, like what this does for people. And we're only talking about like last week with Ricky Hatton. Like, people find a lot of solace in combat sports. Like, it's changed people's lives for the better. There's a lot of positive things to say about it. They didn't, and I think that was kind of the end of me having any positive relationships with that scene there. And I felt very kind of cut off from the Irish scene. But same as I went and covered Cerrone fight, Poirier fight, all that kind of stuff. I cover straight down the middle. I praised Conor for his performance against Cerrone. I thought he was going to win the second meeting against Poirier, I remember. But unfortunately, the McGregor story has gone way beyond sport now. Like, there is no personal feeling in it when he is making the headlines he's making. Like, it's just straight reporting at this stage. It's just, there is not a lot of positive things to report.
Don't you think though? I like some of the points that you raise make me feel like it's opposite of how people would expect it to be. I find that when there's somebody that you feel negatively toward, either because of like things that they've done or ways that they've treated you personally, when it comes to covering their fighting career and just the athletic part of it, it's a little easier to put that aside and give them their props when they deserve it. It's when you really like somebody. It's when you have a really positive relationship with them and you come to really like them as a person, kind of what Ariel was talking about there with DC. That is the harder thing to avoid, because like in a way, those are stronger feelings. If you feel positively, if you feel like a kinship with them, especially, you watch somebody who you don't especially like or who you might even dislike, you watch them go in there to fight, and there might be some part of you that's like, hey, if this guy gets his comeuppance here tonight, I will not be sad about it. But you see those guys get knocked out, and then you're forced to have a kind of sympathy for them. But if you watch somebody who you really, really like, and they go in there and something bad happens to them in the cage, as it can happen to absolutely anybody, as has been noted after many a Floyd Mayweather fight, there is no moral value to be found in the result of a prize fight. But you watch somebody you like go through that hurts, man. Like that, I've seen fighters where I've developed really positive feelings for them, and you watch them go in there, and you watch them, not only the physical stuff that happens to you in the cage, but what it means for them emotionally to have gone in there and lost and have disappointed themselves, and what they're going to feel in the days and the weeks to come. You really feel that for them. And that, I think, is harder to set aside. It's a lot easier to set aside where you're just like, okay, this person has been an asshole to me, but a lot of people have been assholes to me, and maybe sometimes I even deserved it. But when you like somebody, it's harder to set that aside and treat them neutrally.
So what comes to mind, Chuck, when you think of this?
You're human beings, right? Like sometimes when people are like, you can't be biased, I'm like, well, that's impossible on some level. You're going to have a certain amount of bias. A lot of times you'll hear beat writers from other sports that are in a market, and they're like, I have no rooting interest in this, man. I'm just reporting on this team. It's probably better for them to be aside from it. They don't want to be too involved to where there's some kind of emotional entanglement there. They want to stay objective, and that makes complete sense when you're dealing with a team. You're dealing with guys and sometimes within a faceless organization, and there's a lot going on. But fighting is a lot different in the sense like it is a person, right? Or it's a coach, but you have these relationships, especially when you've been in the game a long time, where you've talked to these guys, you start to know a lot of inner truths and like insights into what's happening in their lives. And unfortunately, man, you cannot be detached from that. So when you see certain people that you have a fondness for, just human reaction over time, it's going to affect you when they lose. I would like to say, though, I mean, honestly, this panel here, I especially whatever the result is, and if you put yourself in negative headlines, your job is to detach from it, right? Like you got to stay objective. And I think that when it really comes down to it, that's what you do. I've had people get mad over stuff I've written, just thinking that you were a bigger supporter of theirs. But I'm like, well, I'm a journalist. I'm a writer. I'm a columnist. I'm whatever I'm doing. But it's like, I'm not a personal friend. And I've tried to keep it that way, just like you, Ariel, for the longest time. If there was any kind of friendship developing, I would almost be standoffish with those fighters because you're just like, I can't get entangled that way. But over the course of time where you just know guys, you just know people in the game long enough, you start to know their families or like whatever, that's very difficult,
The reaction that we have and also the fans' reaction is very interesting because I think of the Rampage Jackson, Raja Jackson story. And when this story broke, I was on vacation and I tried to do my best to just kind of disconnect for the most part, not have any outlandish hot takes or anything like that. And all the messages I was getting was, oh, you're not going to talk about this.
I saw that.
Because he's your guy. Okay. And then I come on the show and I say, this was disgusting. This was awful. This is that. And like, oh man, you're a rat. I can't believe you ratted out your friend's son like that. I was like, what? So it's all this stuff where it's like the media is viewed as we're going to protect our friend, and then if you try to actually call it down the middle and say, yeah, this was not good, relationships, be damned, you're viewed as someone who betrayed your quote unquote friend. When in reality, I think we're just all trying to do the best job possible. We're all just trying to be as honest and fair as possible, unbiased as possible. As you said, Chuck, we're all human beings. So I remember one time seeing a feature on Will Leach of Deadspin, and he talked about this idea that like, oh, you have to be old school journalist down the middle. It's black and white. And he's like, no, I'm a Cardinals fan, and I'm going to root for the Cardinals, and I'm going to write favorably about the Cardinals. And that was kind of the first time that I thought like, oh, maybe this is okay. And now you see it go all the way in sports media where it's like halftime of the Knicks Pacers and Stephen A. Smith is like openly rooting for the Knicks. I think that's way too far. I don't want to see that in MMA where like you go to the panel and someone's openly rooting for a fighter to win. But I think everyone here does a very good job of, hey, we have relationships, people, you go way back with people. But if something needs to be said, something needs to be said. I want to ask you guys about one more thing, and that's on the record versus off the record, because PT, this came up in my conversation with Logan Paul, where he was like, yeah, I told you something. Now, worth noting, his whole recounting of the turn of events was completely wrong. Like every single detail was wrong. But it did make me think of on the record versus off the record, because he said, oh, when I was DMing you, I thought you were DMing me as a friend. And my thing to him was, it's always off the record. This is why you're wrong. It's always off the record for me, unless you say on the record. Now, I know a lot of journalists don't believe in that. In fact, I remember, and this is way back when, so I think enough time has passed. I remember getting a phone call from Mark Hunt yelling at the top of his lungs about some guy for some website who called him up and asked him a bunch of questions about a controversial thing that was happening in his life at that point. And then some 30 minutes later, an article with those quotes were up, and he's like, I'm getting a massage. And you can imagine Mark Hunt upset. And this guy calls me up, hits me with some questions, and now all of a sudden I see on this prominent website all my quotes. What the hell? Who is this guy? I didn't work with that guy. It wasn't the site that I was working at. But it made me think like, oh, fighters sometimes need to be told this is on the record, when I think the rules of journalism would suggest, like, if they know you're a journalist and you're calling them up, asking them questions, it's actually always on the record. But I've learned over time that fighters and managers don't think that. So my personal rule is, unless we say we're on the record, we're off the record. Don't worry, I will never betray that trust. How would you feel about that, PT? And have you ever been in those situations where someone thought that you were off the record, you thought you were on the record, and now you get in trouble or at least get yelled at because they thought opposite of you?
This is so many times this has happened, and it's very obvious for me when we're committing something to the record or I'm using something in the interview, because honestly, like, the tools of the trade will do you a lot of service in this regard. Like, if you, like, back when I was just a writer, I'd have a dictaphone on me and I'd talk to the guy or whatever, and I'd say, right, I'm going to turn this on now. So whatever we're saying now is going to be in this article. You know what I mean? Like, that's what we're doing now. On a Zoom call, like, you jump on a Zoom call, you say, listen, I'm about to record this now, so this is what we're doing. I've had many situations, and not from like any like massively prominent fighters, where they'll say something to me and I will write it down word for word. But then when they see it in an article, like, I think their manager might ring them and they completely shit the bed. And they're like, oh, I can't put that up. I'm like, it's on a fucking website. Like, what do you want me to fucking do, mate? Like, you just said that shit to me. I thought that was a good headline. In fact, if you take that piece out of this fucking interview, there's nothing notable in it. Right. So what are you doing? I've also had situations where, this situation, Ariel, and I don't want to address who the person is, but I once spoke to a person in someone's camp, in a big stars camp, and it was like the origin story of this fighter. And this guy told me an amazing story. This is amazing. Like, I was like, holy God. I put it out. And I put the thing out. Ariel,
you can tell us everything, Pizza. We're off the record.
Yeah, we're off the record.
We're off the record. Sorry. I can remember Ariel texted me going like, wow, that's incredible, And then 2 minutes later, the person this is about just got onto me there. And I was like, what the fuck? And then I was like, this guy told me all these stories, and they just completely made them up. But
what?
Yeah.
They didn't want you to put them out?
The person who the guy was telling the stories about and all the things they did together had no recollection of any of these things that this guy had said. Wow. And it was before a really big fight. And I wish I could tell you what I'm talking about, but it was off the record.
Well, see, I think Pete is a good point that, like, sometimes the act of recording is enough to signal. But to me, I've always taken the approach, like, if I contact you and I say, hey, I'm Ben Fowlkes from Yahoo Sports, you had a couple minutes to talk, or I want to ask you about these things. Do you have a couple minutes to talk? That right there should tell you what we're doing. We're not just chatting at that point. I'm not asking just because I'm a curious fellow. I told you, I am this person from this media outlet and I want to talk to you. That should tell you right there that what I want to know is stuff that I can put in an article. Now, it's on you if there's stuff that you want to say to me, either to give me like background information or to help fill me in on the context, but that you don't want that to be attributed to you or that you don't want that quote in there. That is up to you to say. And just because you say it, though, it's up to us to come to some agreement about it. Because it's one thing if you say, like, hey, look, can I tell you something off the record? And then you pause,
right?
And you wait for me to tell you, like, okay, sure. Like, because some people like to think that they can throw that in there and hey, if I say off the record afterwards or at some point later on, then I just erase it. They forget that the reporter is the one who controls the record. Now, you'd be a real asshole maybe to go and say like, hey,
Right.
I'm taking this, I'm using it anyway, whether you like it or not. But I think people, as with many industries, people think they know what the rules of journalism are just because they have been a consumer of it. But that doesn't mean that you know like how the ethics of it and how the practice of it are actually supposed to work. I also think that, you deal with NFL players or NBA players, people who went through some sort of like major collegiate program that gave them at least some kind of media training, might give them a better sense of what to expect. In fighting, it's kind of a wide open world. You got a lot of people who don't really have any experience dealing with the media, and so they may get surprised. Sometimes they like the story just fine until somebody else gets mad at them or somebody else pushes back on them, and then they decide suddenly they were taken out of context or they don't like what you read or wrote or maybe they think they never said it. Like all that kind of stuff can happen. But I think as far as like, if sometimes I've been in situations with fighters where I realize afterwards, did they think I just wanted to be their friend? Did they think I just wanted to be a buddy? And I think that maybe they did. I think that they think, hey, well, yeah, we're cool guys. You want to hang out with us, of course, because like you want to feel cool by association with us. And I'm like, no, man, I'm here working. I'm here to see what I can learn that I can then use to like write a story for other people to consume. That's the whole reason I'm here. And I think that they sometimes don't always understand that, and they think that I'm working with them to present some sort of polished product, and that's just not the way it is. What they think
Well, they learn from the boss. They learn from the
is,
boss, Dana. That's the thing. It's like what's the almost famous thing? Just like make me look cool, dude.
Yeah.
That's it's literally like what these guys. A lot of times, I will tell them, especially on a larger piece, I'm going to turn this on. If there's anything off record, you just tell me, right? Like if you don't want something in there, like if you say it and you're like, oh, you know what? Just tell me, right? Like, and I won't use that piece. But there are times, like I was talking to Peyton Talbot, and he's not a guy who's going to, like, I think he would let everything be on the record, but he's starting to say outlandish stuff. He's starting to, they're doing crazy things, and you're like, you start to wonder, like, if I mention this, am I going to be dealing with something? Because it's just so different than anybody else, or it might look like he's looking past his opponent, or maybe he's drinking or doing drugs. He wasn't doing that, but like if he was doing that, like there were guys in the house, right, like who are doing stuff like this. Like, are you gonna regret putting it in there and get the call? Because I've had that happen, and it's always one of those things though, because you're like, at some point there's just an understanding when you're doing like a feature or something that, hey man, from this point on, we're on record unless you tell me specifically, like that we're not, And I had one big situation where I guess it was a big situation at the time for me, where I was talking to John Jones right after he beat Mauricio Hua. Like it was like a next day or 2 days later in the morning. I got some coffee with him. I was sitting there with him, and doing this piece for this magazine. And one of the things that we talk about all this stuff, all over the map. And at the very end, I was asking him about beer sponsors. He's like, I would never do that sort of thing. And so I was going down this list, and then I was like, what about fighting Anderson Silva? Because at the time, Anderson is the guy, and he was like, oh man, wouldn't that be something? He starts going on about it. And anyway, like, so I'm like, this is really interesting, the Anderson Silva, because I knew people would be interested in would he want that fight? Could this fight happen? I put it in there, and the next day, his manager called me up and like, just, the long 20 minutes, it was just like a shouting thing, and I'm like, dude, he never, like, we were on the record, I can play it, he never said that. I'm like, yes, he did say that, and I actually saved John Jones back then. I've told you guys this before, because this was the episode where he was like polishing his halo the whole time, like, hey, we don't do any bad things. But then at the end he goes, I'm high as fuck right now, man. And I was like, what? And then I'm like, I can't use that though, because that clearly was off record, but I'm like, I mean, not that, but I think we know John Jones now, so I don't feel like I'm turning anything in. But it was a crazy episode, man. And that's when I really, like, I made me very, very paranoid about what people told me. So I would then from that point on be like, hey, are we good to mention this? You'd always kind of ask.
Man, I love these war stories. Yeah. This reminds me of us going,
everybody has a John Jones one, man.
It is fun.
I know.
I got another John Jones one where I remember talking about his Nike deal. Remember the much talked about Nike deal? And I said that it wasn't for a lot of money. It was kind of like a merch deal. It was for like a minimal amount, but I think when we all thought he's getting this Nike deal, he's going to get millions of dollars like Michael Jordan and all this stuff. And I remember I was out in the country with my family. I think I only had one child, very young, and I got a call from someone who then quickly put him on the phone. And he said, "I'm never going to talk to you again unless you tell me who told you that." And I was like, I'm pretty young in the game here. I'm like, what do you want me to do here? You know what I mean? Like, you're never going to talk to me again because you want to know who my source is? And that's another thing that I've always felt very strongly about. Like, you got to protect your source. You can't, if you're known as the guy who's going to like buckle under that pressure, you're done. You're done because that's gonna get out there. And so, yes, we could do these stories. We could talk about these stories, but we're going to put a pin in it now. This was so much fun, guys. Really, really appreciate it. Tremendous stuff. Chuck, PT, Ben, all members of Uncrowned. And by the way, Ben, when you call people up these days, just say Uncrowned. Like everyone knows what it is. You don't have to tell them.
That's right.
We love Yahoo. But, we're now the number one unbiased combat sports outlet on the planet. So everyone kind of perks up, I think, when they hear that. Tremendous stuff. Appreciate you guys very much. Check out all their great work on uncrowned.com. Of course, The Crack with Petesy Carroll. You could see these three fellas with him each and every week. And it's a joy to listen to as we head into the weekend each and every week. I'm Ariel Helwani. That's Chuck Mindenhall, Petesy Carroll, Ben Fowlkes. Thank you so much for watching this first installment of The Beat. Hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you next time.